I knew I shouldn't have signed that form, actually. No, there is a wider legal geography conversation that some of us have been having sort of on the periphery of this conference, which I think speaks to a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Should I use this one? I think this is easier. So, let's turn this one on. Anyway, I just want to thank everyone at Urban Transformations for the very generous invitation to speak at this conference. And I thought what I'd try to do with my paper was to see it more as a kind of almost intervention and telescope and weave in some of the discussions and themes that we've been having over the course of the past 2 days, but also the ways in which they fold into or graft onto some of the work that I've been doing for the past few years. And so, by way of introduction, I come very much to the question of the good city, whether we want to call it a normative project or perhaps even an alternative one, from the perspective of prefigurative politics and more specifically the actions of urban squatters in the global north. And so, in some sense, I'm sort of working with a question that Monique raised right at the beginning in her keynote yesterday about the notion of what it means to put human flourishing and human rights at the center of the good life in the city, at the center of what we might see as a kind of critical, or in my eyes, an alternative urbanism. And so the kinds of prefigurative politics that have been the center of my own work, and the forms of collective life, and I'm deliberately using Teresa Caldera's phrase now, that kind of, I think, weave through what I'm doing, the modes of support, modes of anchoring, are very much tied to a question of urban occupation, urban squatting. And this is work that's focused on the history of squatting, in the first instance in Berlin, where I've done much of my work, both in an ethnographic but equally an archival key, and more recently across Europe and North America more generally. And so in a recently published book entitled Metropolitan Preoccupations, I attempted to chart and attend to the everyday spatial practices and political imaginaries of squatters. And again, the notion of the everyday is something that I think Teresa Caldera picked up in a very useful way this morning already. And it's something that I think my own work speaks to in a rather different conjuncture. And so one of the things that book really tried to do was really just understand and make sensible the assembling of alternative collective spaces in the city of Berlin. And it took in developments in both the former West and East. And so the idea was that for squatters, the city of Berlin came to represent both a site of political protest, and in some cases, they mobilized the language of social movements, but equally was a site of creative reappropriation. And for many squatters, the idea was really to assemble, if you like, a rather different kind of urban infrastructure, experimental, insurgent, and makeshift. And this was ultimately a project that sought to develop a rich historical account of the various struggles in the city over the making of an alternative urban imagination, not to mention the search for new radical solutions to a lack of housing and infrastructure. So at stake here was what squatters actually did, the terms and tactics they deployed, the ideas and spaces they created. And so it's perhaps no surprise that in the context of Berlin, that history of squatting, first in the West, but later in the former East, was characterized by its sheer diversity, attracting students, apprentices, dropouts, runaways, punks, anarchists, gay and lesbian groups, queer and trans activists, anarchists, environmentalists, migrants, and refugees. And my own focus was on really trying to collect, if you like, the various voices, the ideas, the practices and knowledges produced by squatters while retracing those transversal paths of revolt that they themselves often followed. And so the idea of that first book was really to invite readers to step in and think with and alongside squatters whose actions were documented in magazines, in posters, in films, and other sources that were often written and recorded in the white heat of the moment. And so building on that Berlin-based project, I more recently, last year, published a more popular history of squatting in Europe and in North America entitled The Autonomous City. And the historical arc of that book retraces the emergence once again of squatting that coincided with the rise of new social movements across Europe and North America in the late 1960s. And it follows a major cycle of militancy that characterized the 1970s and 80s in particular. Of course, in one sense, this flowed from the actions of Italian autonomia, but also to the countercultural agitprop that shaped the practices and tactics adopted in Northern European cities, be they Amsterdam, Berlin, Copenhagen, Hamburg, and London. And so running through both of those projects was a very basic question about the analytical, but equally the methodological openings that squatters offer to critical urban researchers. And perhaps I hope in the context of this particular session, also the ways in which they inhabit quite a liminal position in the context of debates about urban governance, especially in the global north. And so at stake here was really a form of theorizing, but I think also maybe we can also think of it as a form of politics that seeks to capture the provisionality of the actions adopted by squatters, not to mention the significance of squatted spaces for our understanding of the city as a site of political contestation. And what remains important for me in this context is not really to impose or project a new theory of spatial politics onto the actions of squatters, but instead to try and change the very look of the material of theory itself. And so I was really excited by what Teresa Caldera was saying earlier about this kind of form of collective life as a kind of almost ambient common sense, perhaps in not so much juxtaposition, but in relationship to the question of social movement and social movements and the repertoire of action they often mobilize. And so the modest theoretical footprint of the kind of work that I've been doing over the past decade or so emerges from concepts and practices that were imminent to the actions of squatters. And so I guess my remaining comments this morning are really geared towards telescoping those earlier projects into a wider conversation that we may want to have about the very nature of urban governments, and to recenter how we think about the relationship between a new politics, between social transformation and urban governance. And I should add that as a scholar who has predominantly worked in the global north with squatters in particular contexts, I'm operating at a rather different scale in the form of auto-construction that we just heard about in really exciting and important detail. And I should also flag up the fact that the relationship to questions of illegality, irregularity are rather different, though I would also argue that the state or forms of governance are equally implicated. So what I want to do is really treat this session as an opportunity to carve out a problem space that not only insists on the enduring significance of the city for the making or prefiguring of alternative forms of political claim making, and sometimes forms of claim making that sit in a rather uncomfortable relationship to the state. But I also think it's important that we sound a more skeptical note around some of the debates about the new municipalism that we hear here, not only in the UK but across Europe. And while we see some really emergent forms of practice in cities such as Barcelona and Naples, we need to also be mindful that those practices are also operating in a wider field of intensified precarity and weaponized forms of dispossession and displacement. So I think a cautionary note is quite instructive if we're going to begin to think about the hinge between social movements and other forms of collective life and the question of urban governance. And so what I wanted to do to end is really just provide three provocations, three frames of reference as a starting point for acknowledging the significance of squatting, the significance of urban squatters, not only as a social movement, but other ways in which they begin to interrogate and produce other forms of life in cities. And so I've called those three frames of reference: archive, inhabitation, and infrastructure. And so I actually want to begin by actually picking up on a point that Monique made in her keynote yesterday, which was to talk about the burden of the future in thinking about sort of a more just way of understanding the urban. And I also want to sort of link that provocative point to the presencing of a particular form of the past as well in that context. And so I guess I should sort of out myself as a historical geographer in this context, and that in this sense I'm really interested in forms of urban practice that also develop what the geographer Sarah Safransky has referred to as a historical diagnostic, and to connect or link the experiences and remainders of historical injustices with contemporary forms of urban theory and practice. And Safransky argues that such a diagnostic, with its commitment to transformative social change, depends on a historical mode of inquiry. And my own modest aim in my ongoing work, much of it which is increasingly looking at the experience of contemporary migrant squatters across Europe, in particular, is to think about how that kind of archival perspective may open up new ways of engaging with the urban, not only as a form of theoretical elucidation, but equally as a mode of practical engagement. And so for urbanists, archive, if you want to call it that, of precarious living is a vital project to understand, and it points to, I would argue, an alternative urbanism and the basic contours of a radically different urban infrastructure as well. And I'm really interested in the idea that we can begin to think about urban squatters in many ways as custodians of a rather different way of thinking about a city, rather than simply protagonists within a social movement. And I'm just interested in where that might take us in the ways in which we think about the nature of urban practice, and also to perhaps sound a slight dissatisfaction with debates within social movement studies around the nature of the ways in which they think about urban squatters and their preoccupation with positioning them as a social movement, rather than understanding the everyday practices, the tacit knowledges that they mobilize and produce. And I think part of that process is a profoundly historical one. And I'm, in some sense, drawing inspiration from the very existence of often makeshift archives that are produced by squatters themselves as a way of understanding the places that they've inhabited, but perhaps more importantly, the places they've produced as well. So many of the collections that I've worked in across Europe and North America, some of them have become institutionalized, others haven't, point, I hope, to the making of something of an alternative urban infrastructure and the ways in which squatters position themselves as part of a living archive of practices that seek to think differently about the city. And so there's something here that I think I want to kind of push back, not so much push back on, but kind of think about that relationship between the past, present, and future when we think of a term like the good city. So that's kind of my first point, which is to kind of speak within an archival register. And of course, there's so much more we can pick up on that, maybe in questions as well, about where are the pressure points when we think about a living archive of practices in southern cities as well. And some of what Malik said yesterday about kind of politics of coordination was really exciting, thinking about where we can begin to think about other forms of archiving. So very quickly, my other 2 points, inhabitation and infrastructure. So inhabitation. Okay, very quickly on inhabitation, I just wanted to sort of echo a comment that's been made by a number of squatters working and scholars working on squatting, both in the global north and south, which is that any adequate theory of squatting in its various geographies needs to get to grips with the fundamental ambiguity that often characterizes life in these places. And again, where I'm beginning to take my own work is to begin to think about the question of inhabitation and its relationship to the enactment of particular forms of livability, agency, and endurance, often in settings of extreme insecurity. And the only point I want to make here about this question is, again, how that relates to notions of governance, and where do we position the kinds of geographies of survival, and I'm using a phrase first used by the geographer William Bungay many, many years ago, in relationship to questions of governance, especially when many of the squatters that I work with are also becoming under the sign of a kind of system of surveillance, control, detention, and removal that in many cases composes the contemporary European border regime. So again, where squatters find themselves in a wider conversation about governance and social movement practice, I think is quite interesting to think about. And finally, to just conclude, the thing that perhaps has animated my work more than anything else recently is the question of infrastructure. And much of my work really hinges on a reading of the making of radical politics as an alternative form of infrastructure. And I'm drawn here to what the anthropologist Brian Larkin, I briefly referred to this yesterday, really described as sort of conceptual unruliness of notions of infrastructure. And I'm interested in how we can begin to place conversations about infrastructure within a wider debate about an ethics of care and hospitality as well, and to what extent we can begin to sort of think about alternative forms, not so much of governance, but forms of commoning perhaps, that open up other spaces of care within our cities. And so I guess if I wanted to end my talk, I've sort of been doing work which perhaps operates in some ways pushing back against some of the accommodations that certain practices around social movements have made to the state in recent years, and the ways in which I think housing activists and squatters find themselves in an increasingly precarious position, obviously in Europe and North America, and elsewhere as well. And that conversation, the way in which we can begin to sort of shift our sightlines to a much richer body of work that is imminent to southern cities, I think is really important. So I think with that in mind, I will leave things there and pass on to Joe. So, thank you very much.